Have you ever wondered what sparked the conflict between NATO and Russia? The seeds of this discord were sown at a NATO conference in Budapest, a little over 2 decades ago. There, a pivotal decision was made that would have far-reaching implications. Despite solemn promises not to do so, it was decided to expand NATO far to the east. This expansion, breaching the trust and boundaries that had previously been set, was seen as a provocation by Russia. This wasn't a move that was taken lightly, nor were its potential consequences overlooked. Ambassador Burns, who served under the Obama administration and is now directing the Central Intelligence Agency, made this point crystal clear. He warned that pushing the boundaries too far could lead to an inevitable clash. His words, "No means no," were not just a simple phrase, but a profound caution against the potential for war. In the late 2000s, this tension escalated significantly. The catalyst was not just the expansion of NATO, but the way it was conducted. Despite the warnings and the promises, the expansion went ahead. This was viewed by Russia not just as an infringement on their territory, but also as a direct challenge to their sovereignty and security. The initial response from Russia was not one of aggression, but rather of a desire for inclusion. President Putin, who initially wanted Russia to join NATO, made these points clear again and again. However, his calls were ignored and the expansion continued, thereby making the conflict with Russia not just a possibility, but an inevitability. So was a conflict with Russia inevitable due to NATO's expansion? As Ambassador Burns warned, no means no. This phrase serves as a reminder that our actions have consequences and pushing boundaries can lead to conflict. It leaves us with the question, could this conflict have been avoided if NATO had adhered to their initial promises? But how did Russia respond to this perceived betrayal by NATO? This is a question that brings us to the heart of the matter, the response of a key player in this geopolitical chess game, Russia's President Vladimir Putin. Initially, Putin had a vision of Russia as a part of NATO. He saw a future where Russia would join the League of North Atlantic Nations, standing shoulder to shoulder with them, defending shared values and interests. This vision, however, began to crumble following the NATO conference in Budapest in 2007 and 2008. The decision made back in the 90s to expand NATO far to the east, despite solemn promises not to do so, planted the seeds of discord. It was at this conference that Putin's stance began to shift dramatically. Putin, a seasoned player in the global political arena, wasn't shy about expressing his concerns. He repeatedly warned NATO about the potential repercussions of their actions. He made it clear that pushing the boundaries, especially after the promises made, would inevitably lead to conflict. Ambassador Burns in Moscow under the Obama administration echoed this sentiment. The man who now directs the Central Intelligence Agency said, "No means no," and warned that pushing the issue could lead to war with Russia. Despite these clear and repeated warnings, the West moved forward with its plans. The expansion of NATO continued, with more and more countries of the Eastern Bloc becoming a part of this North Atlantic alliance. This perceived betrayal by the West led to a fundamental shift in Putin's stance towards NATO. No longer was it seen as an alliance that Russia could or would want to join. Instead, it became a perceived threat to Russia's sovereignty and security. Despite Putin's repeated warnings, the West's actions seemed to make a conflict all but inevitable. As we move forward in our discussion, we'll delve deeper into the impact of these decisions on the political landscape of Ukraine, a nation caught in the crossfire of these geopolitical machinations. Now, let's delve into the controversy surrounding Ukraine's leadership. There are serious doubts about the legitimacy of the Zelensky regime in Ukraine. Many question whether Zelensky is the popularly elected leader of Ukraine. His leadership has come under scrutiny, with critics expressing skepticism about his electoral victory. The situation is further complicated by a lack of trust and a pervasive sense of unease among the Ukrainian population. Zelensky is not only a polarizing figure, but he's also widely feared and despised within his own country. The root of this fear and hatred, the Ukrainian secret police. This covert force operating under the Zelensky regime has been accused of silencing any opposition, instilling fear in those who dare to challenge Zelensky's leadership. This fear, coupled with the looming threat of retaliation, has created an atmosphere of intimidation and repression. The Zelensky regime, which was once seen as a beacon of hope for some, now stands as a symbol of controversy. His leadership style, characterized by strong-arm tactics and a seeming disregard for democratic norms, has led many to question his true intentions. The Zelensky regime is now seen as a fatally wounded animal. It's dying, and as it gasps for its last breaths, it's striking out in any way it can. This desperate struggle for survival is not only a testament to the regime's decline, but also a stark reminder of the volatility of political power. In the midst of all this, Zelensky himself remains a controversial figure. His popularity, or rather the lack of it, is a clear indication of the disillusionment and dissatisfaction among the Ukrainian people. His regime, once promising and hopeful, now stands on shaky ground, teetering on the edge of collapse. An unstable regime, a fearful populace, a perfect storm for conflict. This is the current state of Ukraine under the Zelensky regime. As we peel back the layers of this complex issue, we begin to see the true nature of this controversy and the potential it has to ignite a larger, more destructive conflict. But what happens when a regime feels its end is near? A regime wounded and dying can act out in desperate, unpredictable ways. Just take a look at Zelensky's reign in Ukraine. His legitimacy within his own country is dwindling, but fear keeps his opposition quiet. The Ukrainian secret police, ever watchful, ever threatening, ensure that any challenges to Zelensky's rule are swiftly silenced. But how does a leader, widely hated yet widely feared, convince people that his regime still holds power? How does he persuade them that against all odds, he could still turn the tide and emerge victorious? And what if, fueled by a desire for personal vengeance, he decides to strike out in any way he can? Consider the recent terrorist attack in Moscow. The perpetrators weren't jihadists, but rather mercenary thugs, possibly from Central Asia. They were promised a hefty sum to carry out this act of terror, an act that reeks of desperation. The planning was haphazard, the execution sloppy, but they did manage to find a cache of weapons within the country, a sign of external involvement. The aftermath was predictable. Many of the culprits were captured, their escape as poorly planned as their attack. They were found in a forested area, trying to take the same route back to Ukraine from which they came. It's a rookie mistake, one that seasoned insurgents or espionage agents would never make. This desperate act, this last gasp of a dying regime, has sent shockwaves through the international community. But it's not just about a terrorist attack or a failed escape. It's a stark reminder of what can happen when a regime backed into a corner lashes out in desperation. So what does this mean for Ukraine, for Zelensky, and for the world at large? It's a question that we'll continue to grapple with as we watch this situation unfold. But one thing is clear. The desperate last stand of a dying regime can have far-reaching consequences, and the cost can be devastating. A dying regime's last gasp, but at what cost? So what happens when a desperate act is exposed? Well, let's take a look at the aftermath of the Moscow attack. In an almost theatrical turn of events, the terrorists were captured not due to their sophisticated tactics, but rather their lack of them. Their plan, it appears, was as haphazard as it was audacious. They had somehow managed to acquire a cache of weapons within the country itself, a move that reeks of the handiwork of intelligence agencies. Armed with these weapons, they committed the atrocity, and then, in a move that would make even a novice spy cringe, they got into the very same vehicle they arrived in and attempted to flee via the same route back to Ukraine. Now you'd think that seasoned insurgents or espionage agents would know better than to make such rookie mistakes, but these were no seasoned insurgents. They were, as it turns out, more akin to mercenary thugs lured by the promise of a hefty payday. And so, almost inevitably, they were captured. The majority were apprehended en route back to Ukraine, in a forested area no less. One of the captured terrorists had been mutilated, his ear cut off. This grim discovery understandably incensed the Russian authorities. When questioned, the Spetsnaz group that had apprehended the terrorists stood in unison, each claiming responsibility for the act. This display of solidarity, it seems, has only bolstered their standing within Russia, where they are now viewed as heroes. But what does all this mean in the grand scheme of things? How does it fit into the increasingly complex puzzle that is the conflict between NATO and Russia? Well, it underlines a stark reality, that desperation can lead to reckless actions, that the promise of money can turn ordinary people into tools of violence, and that the repercussions of such violence can reverberate far beyond the immediate victims. In a world where every action has a consequence, it's clear that the conflict between NATO and Russia is far from over.